The Wood Beyond the World. Chapter 15. The Slaying of the Quarry. So they walked on quietly thence some half a mile, and ever the lady would have Walter to walk by her side, and not follow a little behind her, as was meet for a servant to do, and she touched his hand at whiles as she showed him beast and fowl and tree. And the sweetness of her body overcame him, so that for a while he thought of nothing save her. Now when they were come to the thicket side, she turned to him and said, Squire, I am no ill woodman, so that thou mayst trust me that we shall not be brought to shame the second time, and I shall do sagely, so knock an arrow to thy bow, and abide me here, and stir not hence. For I shall enter this thicket without the hounds, and arouse the quarry for thee, and see that thou be brisk and clean shooting, and then shalt thou have a reward of me. Therewith she drew up her skirts through her girdle again, took her bent bow in her hand, and drew an arrow out of the quiver, and stepped lightly into the thicket, leaving him longing for the sight of her, as he hearkened to the tread of her feet on the dry leaves, and the rustling of the brake as she thrust through it. Thus he stood for a few minutes, and then he heard a kind of gibbering cry without words, yet as of a woman, coming from the thicket, and while his heart was yet gathering the thought that something had gone amiss, he glided swiftly, but with little stir, into the brake. He had gone but a little way ere he saw the lady standing there in a narrow clearing, her face pale as death, her knees cleaving together, her body swaying and tottering, her hands hanging down, and the bow and arrow fallen to the ground. And 10 yards before her a great-headed yellow creature crouching flat to the earth and slowly drawing nigher. He stopped short, one arrow was already notched to the string, and another hung loose to the lesser fingers of his string hand. He raised his right hand and drew and loosed in a twinkling. The shaft flew close to the lady's side, and straightway all the wood rung with a huge roar as the yellow lion turned about to bite at the shaft which had sunk deep into him behind the shoulder, as if a bolt out of the heavens had smitten him. But straightway had Walter loosed again, and then, throwing down his bow, he ran forward with his drawn sword gleaming in his hand, while the lion weltered and rolled but had no might to move forward. Then Walter went up to him warily and thrust him through to the heart and leapt aback, lest the beast might yet have life in him to smite, but he left his struggling, his huge voice died out, and he lay there moveless before the hunter. Walter abode a little, facing him, and then turned about to the lady, and she had fallen down in a heap whereas she stood and lay there all huddled up and voiceless. So he knelt down by her, and lifted up her head, and bade her arise, for the foe was slain. And after a little she stretched out her limbs, and turned about on the grass, and seemed to sleep, and the color came into her face again, and it grew soft and a little smiling. Thus she lay a while, and Walter sat by her watching her, till at last she opened her eyes and sat up, and knew him, and smiling on him said, What hath befallen, Squire, that I have slept and dreamed? He answered nothing, till her memory came back to her, and then she arose, trembling and pale, and said, Let us leave this wood, for the enemy is therein. And she hastened away before him till they came out at the thicket side whereas the hounds had been left, and they were standing there uneasy and whining. So Walter coupled them while the lady stayed not, but went away swiftly homeward, and Walter followed. At last she stayed her swift feet and turned round on Walter, and said, Squire, come hither. So did he, and she said, I am weary again. Let us sit under this quicken tree and rest us. So they sat down, and she sat looking between her knees a while, and at last she said, Why didst thou not bring the lion's hide? He said, Lady, I will go back and flay the beast, and bring on the hide. And he arose therewith, but she caught him by the skirts, and drew him down, and said, Nay, thou shalt not go, abide with me. Sit down again. He did so, and she said, Thou shalt not go from me, for I am afraid, I am not used to looking on the face of death. She grew pale as she spoke, and set a hand to her breast, and sat so a while without speaking. At last she turned to him smiling, and said, How is it with the aspect of me when I stood before the peril of the enemy? And she laid a hand upon his. O gracious one, quoth he, thou wert as ever, full lovely, but I feared for thee. She moved not her hand from his, and she said, Good and true squire, I said ere I entered the thicket e'en now that I would reward thee if thou slewest the quarry. He is dead, though thou hast left the skin behind upon the carcass. Ask now thy reward, but take time to think what it shall be. He felt her hand warm upon his, and drew in the sweet odor of her mingled with the woodland scents under the hot sun of the afternoon, and his heart was clouded with manlike desire of her. And it was a near thing but he had spoken, and craved of her the reward of the freedom of her maid, and that he might depart with her into other lands. But as his mind wavered betwixt this and that, the lady, who had been eyeing him keenly, drew her hand away from him, and therewith doubt and fear flowed into his mind, and he refrained him of speech. Then she laughed merrily and said, The good squire is shamefaced, he feareth a lady more than a lion. Will it be a reward to thee if I bid thee to kiss my cheek? Therewith she leaned her face toward him, and he kissed her well favoredly, and then sat gazing on her, wondering what should betide to him on the morrow. Then she arose and said, "Come, squire, and let us home, be not abashed, there shall be other rewards hereafter." So they went their ways quietly, and it was nigh sunset against they entered the house again. Walter looked round for the maid, but beheld her not, and the lady said to him, "I go to my chamber, and now is thy service over for this day." Then she nodded to him friendly and went her ways.